Today, I'd like to introduce my new book, The Lost Spring. The Lost Spring is a book which addresses the following issues. Number one, why wasn't the West ready for the Arab Spring? That would be the first point I'd like to address. Two, why were we not able, when I say we, meaning the administration and other European governments, to address those challenges once they've happened, once they've exploded across the region? And three, obviously, the current state of the Arab Spring in terms of revolts, where was success, and where are the problems. In some cases, we're talking about disasters, as the case is in Syria and could be also in Libya and Iraq as well. I will also talk about what could have been done. This is a question that has not been very well addressed before, even in the presidential debate of 2012. And last, if you want, what can be still done under this administration, because there are things that could be done with this Congress, but also with the next Congress, and most likely, most logically, with the next administration. So I'm going to try to cover that in about 25 minutes, and then I'll be very happy to engage with you about your thoughts with regard to this issue. With regard to the question of why were we not ready, meaning why wouldn't the US administration agencies be able to predict and or to project that social upheaval was happening in the region, was to explode everywhere. If you look at the national security estimate that our government put together every year around the fall, if you look at that estimate in 2010, you wouldn't find any trace to what became later on known as the Arab Spring. Unlike, for example, during the Cold War, when Gorbachev came to power and the reforms have started, perestroika and glasnost, they were in the United States and in the West in general, projections that a malaise, an issue of rejection of reform was happening in Eastern Europe. That was not the case in the Arab world. And I'm saying this because this book, The Lost Spring, is actually a book that is the continuation of a previous one. So let me say a couple of words about my previous book. In 2010, also with my agent, Lynn, we went to see a publisher here in New York, Simon & Schuster, to publish a book with a title that was a little bit challenging. My title for my previous book was The Coming Revolution. It was in the summer of 2010, in terms of projecting three things. In that book, I projected, number one, that civil societies in the region across the board, and we could go into cases one after the other, have reached a point whereby they wanted to reject oppression and suppression of any kind. Should it be the dictators, the authoritarian leaders, those who are with us, Mubarak, Ben Ali, and those who are anti-American, such as Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, or those who are in between, were in between, Gaddafi and others. So there was a push by civil society, and I will explain how did I came to this conclusion. Wave number two is that once these dictators or leaders will start to go down or will go down, there will be a race. And I remind you, this was projected before the Arab Spring. There will be a race between the forces that are going to try to replace the dictators, the so-called rebels. There will be two forces. One are definitely the Islamists of all kind, the pro-Iranian Islamists known as the Khomeinists. That would include Hezbollah and all their allies in the region, but also the vast network of Salafists. That would include the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Nahda of Tunisia, and others. So those two forces, once the central governments or the dictators will go down, automatically, obviously, what comes after is a race. This is not Eastern Central Europe, whereby communist regimes will go down, and the previous experience of these Eastern Central European countries with multi-party system will come back, although it could be mediocre, as we saw it in many European countries. The comeback of liberal democracy was not as easy, but we could have predicted what and how these political parties that we were familiar with would act. But in the Middle East, the problem was that most of our intelligentsia, opinion makers, media, but also academia, was not even very helpful in determining what kind of race will exist immediately after the fall of these regimes. I'm still talking about my previous book. And third, I've argued that eventually the Islamists will take over in many places because they are best organized, better funded. So these are statistical parameters that are unescapable. But eventually, the first wave of youth, of seculars, of reformists, women, and minorities, the first ones will come back as a third wave. Now, once I've published a book in early November, a few weeks later, the so-called Arab Spring began. And it actually somewhat followed the path of the projections we've done. Wave number one, Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. I would even argue the first few months of the Syrian uprising were produced by civil society forces. Now, once I say civil society forces, we cannot compare to civil society forces in Europe or here or even in Latin America. These are different civil society forces. But the general trend would be the same. In Tunisia and Egypt, civil society forces were organized by youth, mostly liberal youth, liberal in the Middle Eastern sense. Give the example of Egypt, which I cover in my book. The Egyptian revolt began by a Facebook, actually, revolution in Egypt. It got 85,000 hits, and the debate started immediately what to do about this opposition. They didn't know exactly if they were going to bring down the regime or reform the regime. Everything was done in a very hasty way because they were reacting to suppression that the government at the time was part of or has encouraged. Now, 30 to 40,000 of these Facebook members or likers went to Tahrir Square. This is something that was not well described in most of our research. They were the ones who began, and you can see by statistics that most of the members who went to Tahrir Square were either youth, a lot of women, many women of all ages, but also Copts, Christians, and others. It was only weeks later, days or weeks later, that the Muslim Brotherhood came in. The Muslim Brotherhood had observed what has happened. They have tried in the past many years, many decades. They have been suppressed before. They were not able to actually do that regime change or bring down the government. It's only when civil society went in, it was recognized by the international community that the Muslim Brotherhood moved in. So the second wave began really at the time where Mubarak was going down. And the projection was very simple. The most organized, well-funded, media-equipped movement, and I would add one crucial point that I cover in my book, those who will be supported by the international community. It counts. It counts tremendously. Those who will be supported by the international community, meaning specifically by the US administration, are and would be projected as winners in any political battle. The battle of the media. The Brotherhood were seen and projected themselves across North Africa as the reformers, as the rebels. You remember across North Africa, in Washington and many other capitals, there was this one question: who are these rebels? It was amazing to see that we had a total ignorance or significant ignorance of who are these forces. You had those who said these are all reformers and youth and they want change. That was not the case because many of the forces on the ground were Islamists. And you have the other side that said, well, all of these forces are manipulated by the Islamists, which is not true as well. There were two forces on the ground. And the crucial moment came whereby I think we wasted 2 of the 3 years, or 2 to 3 of the 4 years of the uprising, was what did Washington do, and then followed by Brussels. We actually partnered with the Islamist forces across the board. It was done from the first weeks in Cairo. I charge in my book, I actually level a very heavy criticism against our handling of Egypt, which is based not just on my observation, but on report by Egyptian NGOs. The same Egyptian NGOs who led the gigantic demonstration of June 30th, 2013, last year, who brought down actually Morsi, those have been testifying that in the early stage of the revolt, we saw a cooperation, I'm quoting, between the U.S. administration. For them, it was the whole U.S., which was not really the case. It was with the administration, the people in charge of the Egyptian file, and the Muslim Brotherhood. There is a huge literature in Egypt, which is not really available here yet. It will become available, that criticizes the administration for siding with one party. And by siding with one party, and by pressuring the military to accept that equation, which is the reason for why it tilted towards the Brotherhood, Egypt went under Mohammed Morsi, the Mohammed Morsi regime. And of course, the Mohammed Morsi regime, it could be very predictable. People who know the strategies and the tactics and the methods of the Brotherhood would know or can predict and project that this regime is going to slowly, slice after slice, transform Egypt from what it was, ruled by authoritarian, that's true, but by an institution that kept the peace with Israel, that basically was our partner against terrorism and Al-Qaeda, transforming this slowly and very smartly into an Islamic regime, which would slice after slice, as I said, take out all the components, all the institutions of a secular Egypt. So the Morsi regime pushed back against the judges, against the most important Sunni spiritual and theological center, Al-Azhar University. I mean, Al-Azhar was considered by the Brotherhood not enough. They wanted to transform Al-Azhar into a more radical institution. They unleashed their students to try to bring down Al-Azhar. And of course, against the army. And certainly, as we saw in the last few weeks before or few months before the Morsi crumbling, against the youth. Now, the Egyptian opposition, which was successful in the first little wave, understood, and that made the big difference. People say, well, the army was the one that changed it. I disagree. The army could have not changed anything had they not had been supported by millions of Egyptians. The army would have been isolated worldwide. They would have gotten a phone call from Washington, do what Morsi wants. That's what they did in the beginning. But it was a marriage, an equation between a mass uprising against Morsi by regular people. And I'm going to give you the numbers. A couple months before June the 30th, there was a letter. Egypt doesn't have a recall process. You cannot call for the president to go back to the ballot, to the referendum process. So there was a letter asking Mr. Morsi to resign or reform massively. That letter obtained, it's a petition, it obtained 22 million signatures, verified by NGOs around the world. Now, look at the numbers. Mr. Morsi obtained 12.5 million votes. His opponent somewhere around 11.5 or 12. It was very close. Now, according to social scientists, half of the voters of Mr. Morsi, 6 million, were voting against the other guy, who was a Mubarak supporter. So the vote for Morsi was not even a mass Muslim Brotherhood. Egypt knows that there are about 6 million who would vote for the Brotherhood. It's 10 times more their membership, which is 600,000. These are important numbers to deal with. This is a force to be reckoned with, of course. But Mr. Morsi and the Brotherhood and their friends in Washington have claimed that the Brotherhood has an overwhelming majority in Egypt, popular support. That was not the case. And we've seen it in many previous occasions where, in Europe or in Latin America, where radical forces would actually be so well organized they can win an election. Winning one election is not an indicator to the general trend. So the petition got 22 million, so it actually decimated any majority Mr. Morsi had gathered before. Nevertheless, he did not resign. So there was a second push, which even is much more dramatic. There was this mass demonstration of 33 million Egyptians. Now, this number by itself is a worldwide change. We have not seen in the history of humanity anything that would be 33 million over a day and a half. Of course, proportionally speaking, there have been massive demonstrations around the world, including in the Middle East, but nothing like that. This indicated that there is a shift that occurred in Egypt, which we need to invest in. The silent majority moved. Now, the silent majority would give you a measurement of what is the direction they would like to see the society going to. But silent majority is not organized. So this is not something we could bank on and say, well, the silent majority will always do those changes. It is one time in a decade or in a couple of decades that it occurs. Yet they did it twice, one on June the 30th and one in July, to determine that they don't want Egypt to fall under the Muslim Brotherhood. And they were the one who legitimized the interim role of the military. Now, Washington determined that this was a coup, constitutionally speaking. But it did not determine that it was a coup in Kiev, for example. It depends on who's in charge here. But we can come back to that later in the discussion. It was clearly an Obama administration partnership with the Brotherhood that continues, because the Brotherhood lobby, as I argue also in my book, continued to be very influential and strong in America while the Brotherhood regime in Egypt collapsed. And it is strong, as I mentioned in the book, because it's backed by an international network of brotherhood. Now, this is not conspiracy and imagination. This is real information. And this is basically now becoming even more real with the input coming from the Egyptians themselves. In the past, we used to debate about the Brotherhood here in America with what we know. I mean, most of us at least. But what we know is minute compared to what the Egyptians know. And there's a tidal wave of information coming to our shores from Egypt. This is what I predict is going to be a next information in the fight against the jihadists in particular, but against the Islamist radical networks around the world. I will come back to where the region is here, because the Egyptian revolution, the second Egyptian revolution, has had ramifications that most of our academic elite are not even paying attention to. Regional ramifications. There are other countries coming to that block. In Tunisia, let me go over Tunisia quickly. I was fortunate enough to cover Tunisia, even the latest events as they were unfolding. The Nahda Islamist party, which is a cousin to the Brotherhood, understood that opposing the silent majority is going to cost them dearly. They were even, as I was told, advised by Western friends, including in Washington and in Brussels, not to go the way of Morsi and then make significant concessions. So what Tunisia is having now is a government which is basically a neutral bureaucratic government, and they're heading towards the next election. I do project, however, that the secular movement in Tunisia has also learned from what has happened in Egypt. There have been many assassinations in Tunisia of secular leaders, including left-wing, center, conservative. They understand that if the Nahda comes back to power by elections or other means, which I don't think they will come back to power in the next cycle of election. But the point is, as Tunisians have told me, if the Islamists do not reform, deeply reform, they are always Islamists. Their handling with the politics is an interim handling, and the same goes for Egypt. When I'm asked about the future of the Islamist forces, parties, movements in the region, I would say, yes, there could be a case where, Islamist parties could be part of the political process. But I have a condition, an intellectual condition that we have not, the US government has not paid attention to. They need to reform. They need to go the path of these communist Bolshevist parties after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, are they for real or not, but they transform themselves into kind of a socialist parties or parties that can fit with Western liberal democracy. This did not happen with the Muslim Brotherhood. If you don't change your ideology and adapt to some of the principles with all the ramifications, ideological and beyond that, they're still Islamist. Quickly on Libya, Libya probably is the most dangerous place now in North Africa. We went too far, too fast in supporting what seemed to most of us in Washington. And I would say the administration for sure, but even some members of Congress went too far, too fast in considering all of the anti-Gaddafi as rebels. They called them the rebels. And why in reality, the rebels were formed of two groups again. You had former bureaucrats, judges, teachers, military, who were in the Libyan state and rose against the Libyan state. These should have been our partners. And then you have a huge web of Islamist jihadists, militias, groups, and what have you. When we started the support to those rebels, the most organized, those who were actually connected to the international Islamist network, those who were backed by Qatar and the petrodollars, they were the ones who were ready. So when the seculars found themselves in a post-Gaddafi situation, unorganized, disconnected from each other, what you get now in Libya is that Eastern Libya, that would be Benghazi, Barqa, Darna, all these areas are under the control of these militias. We do not recognize that. We say, well, there are some militias in Libya. No, Eastern Libya is under the control of the jihadists. Even inside Tripoli, there are jihadi militias. All the dramatic events that we saw, which I'm not going to spend time on now, unless if you ask me, indicate that Libya has two forces: secular, weak, moderate bureaucrats who are working with the West anyway, and then large network of Islamists who are intending on seizing the central authority in Libya. Now let me move quickly to the Levant, and we would have covered most of the region. No doubt what's happening in Syria is the most dramatic situation in the world. 120,000 people have been killed. I don't want to go over the details. Most of them are civilian, and most of the civilians probably were killed by the regime, but there are many civilians who have been killed by the jihadists, and the YouTube is here to let us know what's happening. Here's how I assessed Syria in my briefings to Congress and to the European Parliament. We had a golden opportunity between March of 2011, when the Syrian revolt began, and December of that same year, say till January of 2012. Geopolitics are very important in the case of Syria. Unlike in Libya, where Gaddafi was isolated, where we could display our kinetic force, in Syria it's different. We had real civil society groups, NGOs and others, who have been rising in the beginning. The first few weeks, if you remember, go back to YouTube, you see that these were demonstrations. It does not mean that many of these demonstrations were not organized also by the Islamists, but the overwhelming majority of these demonstrations were organized by a political opposition. We could analyze the political opposition. We may like it, we may dislike it. That's a different story. But the strategic view of it was that you had civil society rising for a few months. Al-Qaeda was not in deeply yet in those months. Hezbollah was not yet in Syria the way it is right now. And the most important factor was that the Iranian strategic presence was not yet embedded in Syria. Why? Because we were in Iraq. Look at the map, visualize the map. Iraq was a wall. With our presence in Iraq, we were a wall that separated the Iranian regime from the Eastern Mediterranean influence that it had, including in Syria, including in Lebanon. I mean, they were barely able to send support to Hezbollah via air, and to, of course, Gaza via the Red Sea, and so on and so forth. So when we were in Iraq, Turkey in the north, Jordan in the south, and the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean, that would have been the absolute strategic moment to do something about Syria, crumble that regime, but not allow Al-Qaeda to take over. That's the magic equation that everybody has been talking about. But when we started to talk about it, it was too late. There was a moment, there was a window. And when I was questioned in Congress and the European Parliament about how would you do that, again, it's a poor understanding of who's with you and who's against you, who's with democracy, who's against it inside Syria. Now it's a little bit late. Not too late, it's a little bit late. But we had a possibility to work with the minorities first. The northeastern part of Syria has a Kurdish, Christian, and some Arab Sunni moderates not penetrated by Al-Qaeda at the time. We could have begun there. It could have been, and their back was the border between that zone and Iraq is Kurdistan of Iraq. The bottom line, without going into the details, Washington did not have a plan for Syria. And I'm continuing my charge here and say, because we had in mind two things. I'm going to say me. The administration had in mind two things. Across North Africa, the partner would be the Muslim Brotherhood. So we can see it case by case. The end of our policy was that the Brotherhood or their allies would be our partners. not necessarily because of love, but because of the advisors to this administration have argued that this is a stable force that we can do business with. Everything between Beirut and Tehran is the other side. That would be the Iranian regime and its allies, etc. What was the argument made? The argument made to the administration, which is not a secret argument, by the way. It's in research, it's in books, it's in chapters, it's in articles, meaning the academics and NGOs and research centers who tilt towards Iran in the West have been arguing that we can do business with the Iranian regime. These are the same ones who put pressure on Israel not to strike, the same one who put pressure on the Obama administration to pressure Israel not to deal with the Iranian regime, the same group. They argued that if eventually you, i.e. the administration, do business, release some funds, the frozen Iranian assets in the billions of dollars, cut a deal on the nuke, you're going to get an Iranian leadership that would help you across the Levant. That's the equation. It's not that difficult to understand. So in Syria, let me go back to the point of Syria. It would have been logical had we had a Reagan-esque view of the world. It would have been logical to immediately crumble the regime and keep al-Qaeda at bay, and that new regime will be integrated into the moderate bloc that we have been forming. But the problem is that we have been pushing back against the moderate bloc, as in Egypt, with the Muslim Brotherhood. No chance. And there was also the hope that we're going to eventually have a deal with Iran. So let me bring it home here in Syria. Once we got out of Iraq, and by the way, when we got out of Iraq, Iran moved into Iraq. Iran deployed all of its assets, economic, political, intelligence, you know that. So Iraq became a zone of influence for Iran. It borders Syria. So by removing ourselves from Iraq, without a force on the ground that would be stopping the Iranians and keep them separated from the Assad regime, now you have a highway between Iran through Iraq into Syria. It changed everything. Now you have Hezbollah moving into Syria. Now you have al-Qaeda taking advantage of this super Iranian move into Syria to infiltrate and take over and seize more of the opposition. So by 2013, ladies and gentlemen, we have a different Syria. We have a Syria whereby a regional bloc is fighting the battle of Assad to have their eastern front on northern Israel, on Israel. And you have an opposition which has been divided, civil society activity is gone, and now the Islamists and the jihadists are, I don't want to say in full control of all the opposition, but are certainly major pillars of this opposition. So the two questions before we begin our discussion are these. Number one, could have we done otherwise? My answer is yes, but we would have needed another administration. Or, to be very direct, the same administration who would change dramatically its policy. So I'm still objective here. If the same administration would dramatically change its course, we could have done. It did not. If you had a different administration, we could have had different plans. No one guarantees the success, but at least there would have been an alternative. And let me disclose that when I was with the presidential candidate Mitt Romney's team dealing with the Middle East, we did have different ideas. And some of these ideas are outlined in in some of the chapters. They're not secret, but I outlined further details of how these ideas would have actually stopped some of the disasters in 2 years by now. Nevertheless, the situation right now, if no major change would occur in the policy of this administration, if the Congress cannot convince the administration, this one, to change the course, and if next Congress won't also be able to dramatically change and affect this policy, the projections are simple to see. Let me begin with the biggest concern, Iran. Of all countries, Iran is the biggest concern. The Iranian regime has succeeded now in its political operation to do this, to kill our sanctions, the strategy of our sanctions. Because the strategy now is to take out those sanctions little by little. That's how the administration is operating. There are some sanctions, but the idea is to stop the Senate, to stop Congress from adding sanctions. Now, it has been understood by the Iranians that this is good, that they can move forward. It is convincing many businesses around the world. I mean, don't look just at decisions made by the administration, look at what it means to the private sector. It's hurtling towards Iran. The regime is booming, not the country. The regime is getting a lot of cash. Now, add to this the fact that we are sending large sums, Iranian frozen money. What is known now in the media is that $500 million followed by another $500 million, that would be $1 billion and maybe more, have been already released through Switzerland to the Iranian regime. $1 billion. What the Iranian regime can do with $1 billion if it wants to reinvest it in its political campaigns, I'm not talking about terrorism or talking about, because it has the money for that. Just to use that money as strategic communication warfare against us and against their enemies in the region, pretty significant. So the Iranian regime has now less sanctions, more cash, more companies doing business with them, but that is not all. The biggest concern I have is this. The Iranian strategy for the strategic weapons can be understood not just the bomb. Let me make it the simplest possible, as I argue in my book. If the Iranian regime would actually produce an atomic bomb, they know that that weapon will be hit. Will be hit by those in the region, or there will be tremendous pressure worldwide to take it out. So, what would you do? Which explains why they were so gradual and slow in showing us the weapon. They could have showed that weapon a long time. They could have gone faster in the production. Ladies and gentlemen, what the Iranian regime has been doing and will be doing soon is to protect the weapon, a dome. You know, the Israelis have this dome. The Iranians have a dome that they are constructing. So when they would produce the weapon, we cannot take it out. Pure old Cold War strategies. How that? The Iranians have been developing, without any pushback by the international community, a fleet of missiles. I wrote a piece in 2006 when there was a debate about, you know, the fissile material. I said, it's not the fissile, it's the missiles. I think some forces in the region understood that. When you create and produce long-range missiles that could reach the entire Middle East, parts of Europe, our fleets in both waters, the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, right? Why would you do that? You cannot use those missiles with classical explosives. You cannot. It would mean nothing. You can only use those missiles with WMDs, meaning with nukes, including tactical nukes. So what they have been doing was to create this forest of missiles. And then number two, they are deploying in more and more countries, but you've got to always try to intercept their thinking. Those countries where they are deploying influence will become their strategic allies. This is a little NATO or Warsaw Pact, where these countries could deploy Iranian assets, including launching pads, including radars, including everything else. If we don't go that far in understanding the Iranian thinking and think of Iran as Iran, they will surprise us. So, Iran in Iraq, Iran in Syria, Iran in Lebanon, Iran having facilities in Eritrea, maritime facilities, Iran now obtaining more facilities in Port Sudan, that's the Red Sea, Iran arming and supporting rebels in northern Yemen. I mean, read all of that, let alone the Iranian strategic alliance with the Hugo Chavez regime. This is how you understand Iran. With the missiles, with the terrorist cells around the region, when they will ensure that this whole web, plus the anti-aircraft missiles they want to buy from Russia, and now even more than before because of Ukraine, then you'll understand that the Iranians have been buying time. The administration thought that it is using this time to moderate the Iranian regime, and the Iranian regime is buying that time to actually become a nuclear power, and one that can threaten its enemies in the region. And those enemies, it's not just Israel, it's also many Arab countries. The Arab moderate countries are more afraid of Iran than actually Israel. It has a capability of striking back at the Iranians. On Iran, to conclude, the mistake that we've made under the Obama administration and under the bureaucracy of the Bush administration. And I make a distinction here. The narrative of the Bush administration was clear. The bureaucracy that deals with the Middle East under the Bush administration did not follow the actual path of this narrative. And I could digress if you want. So we should have, years ago, when we were already in Iraq, simply and logically support the Iranian opposition. If you want to weaken that regime, if you want to bring down the regime, you just work with the opposition. In June of 2009, unfortunately, had those events of June 2009 happened any year before, probably would have seen a different outcome. Or let me be very clear, under a different administration. Or under a different policy of the same administration, to be as wide as possible. There is an Iranian opposition, there is a readiness among the Iranian people. They don't like this regime. As I mentioned, youth, ethnic minorities, they dislike the regime. But we don't have a policy for them. And what Iran's regime is mostly concerned about are not our kinetic approach. They're concerned about their own opposition. So, having said that, my conclusions would be that if we want to change policy, we're going to reverse everything we have right now. Everything we have, reverse it. With Iran, no deal, no cash. We're not giving cash to the Iranian regime before it changes. We're giving cash to the Iranian opposition. In Syria, we're not giving a pass to the Assad regime on the chemical. We are trying to find the elements in the Syrian opposition with whom we can partner. In Lebanon, we're not going to allow Hezbollah to take over the government. And the president called the prime minister last week of Lebanon to congratulate him about the formation of a government that is the cabinet that is controlled by Hezbollah. You could have your ambassador do that, but that's a lot of recognition for those forces. In Egypt, I wouldn't be pushing back against this government. I would actually be engaging the Egyptian society. You don't want to send weapons to the Egyptian government? Fine. But engage with the Egyptian society that is ready now to engage. And so would be the case in Tunisia. And obviously in Libya, you would just shut down any support to those militias, to the jihadi militias, and work with a secular government. With regard to Israel, I think there should be a change of policy. There should not be strategic pressures on the Israelis when and while they are confronting the Iranians. Separate the Israeli-Palestinian track from the alliance with Israel against the Iranian threat. There would be Hezbollah, Hamas, or the regime. Unfortunately, what is happening right now is that there is a pressure on Israel. We will help you against the Iranians if you actually change dramatically your attitude and position with regard to the Palestinian issue, but that is probably acceptable as an idea, but not as long as Hamas is in control of the Palestinian cart. So, ladies and gentlemen, this book argues that we need a tremendous change in our foreign policy, and thank you so much for inviting me today. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.